Lynchings never ended. Nolan is just the latest. And so, as his family goes through the process of fighting for justice for him, we have to understand that there is something specific we can do if we want to create the foundation that's necessary to seek justice. What up, what up, what up, fearless fighters? This is Dr. Avis. I want to welcome you to today's episode of Fearless Politics. Today, we're going to be talking about the weaponization of whiteness. Weaponized whiteness shows up in a lot of ways. It shows up as an overriding sense of entitlement. It shows up as entitlement to victory, say as in elections. It shows up as entitlement to jobs, say as, oh, well, if you're not a white man, you should not have this job. You must be a DEI hire. It shows up as entitlement to college admissions. It shows up as entitlement to physical space, which leads to intimidation of others who are in spaces where whiteness believes it does not belong. But most glaringly and disturbingly, and quite frankly, consistently throughout our history, has been whiteness showing up as violence. And I would say that the Nolan Wells case is a modern day example of that. This is the first time I've broached this topic on Fearless Politics for a couple of different reasons. Number one, this is very personal for me. Nolan's parents are living my very worst nightmare. I have sons, my youngest of whom is just a couple of years older than Nolan. And quite frankly, the very worst nightmare of millions of parents, and particularly Black parents throughout this nation, because we understand how whiteness works. We understand how whiteness protects one another. We understand how whiteness lies for each other. We understand how whiteness habitually fails to take responsibility for its own actions. We understand how whiteness, at its core, has a history of violence, cover up, dismissal, and complete non-action when the victim of that violence is Black. And so it's been a very personal issue for me just to absorb as a human being. But I also wanted to wait until we had a little bit more information. I really wanted to wait for that independent autopsy to happen. And so that has dropped. I definitely want to talk a little bit about that today. But then most deeply, this episode is going to go into how what's happened with Nolan is nothing new. Instead, what's happened with Nolan is part of a pattern that we have experienced over and over and over again throughout this nation's history. Ida B. Wells most notably chronicled this pattern when she was covering lynchings in America from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And so we're going to delve deep in this episode about how Nolan's case completely coincides with the patterns that we have seen throughout history all the way up until today. With that said, let's get it on and pop it. So Nolan Wells was an 18-year-old young man who went off on the 4th of July to a little island enclave with 3 of his buddies on their boat. All right. And this is the picture that really got everybody in a chokehold. This happened on the 4th of July. They were all going off to have this experience together. Nolan's father later said this was Nolan's last chance to get some fun in before going back to college to prepare for his next season of football. What immediately stood out for folks is that, as this picture shows, he appeared to be the only Black person in the friend group, okay? And what really got people by a chokehold was that these supposed friends were apparently very comfortable with leaving Nolan and coming back home without him, even though they brought him there. All of us know that if we coming together, we leaving together. I mean, that's just kind of like a rule of life. But not only did these young men leave Nolan there in some capacity, we don't know yet. The investigation is still going on, quite frankly, in terms of whether they left him dead or alive, or what are all of the circumstances. But the bottom line is that they came back without him. They did not notify the parents. They had his cell phone and his wallet on their boat. And they didn't even notify the parents that they didn't bring Nolan back home. I mean, this is part of the story that really got me because I am a parent. As I mentioned to you, I'm a parent of two young men. I have, throughout their formative years, have taken them and their friends to different events. And I have never taken them and their friends to an event where I've left said event without everybody who came with me. And on the crazy odd chance that I would, I cannot imagine doing that without at least alerting the parents that their child is going to be left. And I have already determined who they're going to go with to get back home. But let me just say that's a huge extrapolation because the reality is I would never leave without children that I brought to a place, period. So that raised the first red flag of suspicion. The second red flag of suspicion was the fact that immediately upon returning, these friends, quote unquote, erased, wiped out all of their social media presence. These friends have parents who are judges and who are connected with the criminal justice system in some way. These friends have their parent judge reactivate her social media, I would argue, in an effort to weave a story that would exonerate her children. Said parent has continued to be active on social media to continue to spread her version of events and to gain sympathy. She's alive. All of her children are alive. Nolan is not. And from everything that has been reported thus far, none of them have spoken to the police. Red flag after red flag after red flag after red flag. Nolan's parents retain Benjamin Crump and his team. They have ordered their own independent autopsy. And just this week, we heard the results of this autopsy funded by Colin Kaepernick. So here are the top lines of this autopsy. Number one, it's important to note that this autopsy was done after the Mississippi coroner performed their autopsy. So they did not have the ability to see and examine the body originally. That has a large bearing on what the independent autopsy was even able to examine at all. As a result, the independent autopsy came back as inconclusive with regards to the cause of death. However, several inexplicable and disturbing findings were in fact reported in relation to this autopsy. For example, there was red discoloration found in the back of Nolan's head. Now, I will say that Dr. Mitchell, who performed this autopsy, did say that the reason for that discoloration was unclear. Yes, it could mean several things, right? It could mean that there was some blow to the back of his head, but it also could mean that maybe he was laying in some state and some blood was collected there over time. The reason was unclear. There was no lacerations to the skin or broken bones around that area, so he wasn't able to conclude what led to that. But to me, the most striking finding of this autopsy really was about the throat. Completely missing from the remains that were sent to him to examine for this independent autopsy was the anterior internal neck structures. So in other words, his entire throat, the trachea, the larynx cartilage, the thyroid horn and bone, none of that was received with the body. Because none of that was received with the body, the medical examiner retained by the family said that he could not rule out that there weren't injuries inflicted upon Nolan's neck. And given what he's described there in terms of the area that was literally missing, that the state of Mississippi did not turn over for the independent autopsy, clearly that is an area where if it was compromised, that could clearly be a fatal injury. Because of that and other findings throughout with regards to this autopsy, this medical examiner could not rule out foul play in the death of Nolan Wells. This is a very important development. And also important is they found his body just a couple of days after July 4th. Here we are towards the end of the month. Mississippi's coroner has apparently done their own autopsy. They've given the body over to the independent medical examiner to perform an autopsy. The independent medical examiner has performed his autopsy, written up the findings, released the findings. The state of Mississippi has yet to do any of that in terms of releasing findings from the original autopsy, not to mention having any sort of explanation as to why Nolan's throat was not turned over for examination by the second medical examiner. Red flag after red flag after red flag after red flag. But honestly, this is not abnormal when it comes to the history of this nation in terms of Black people ending up dead. And there is a very slow investigatory period that leaves a lot of unanswered questions and worse. In fact, this is part of a regular pattern. And this pattern was first noticed by Ida B. Wells in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Ida B. Wells was a courageous, bold journalist who chronicled lynchings throughout the South in her attempt to get past an anti-lynching act. Believe it or not, something that was never passed until Senator Kamala Harris passed it when she served as a senator in the U.S. Senate. Now, what was this pattern that Ida B. Wells uncovered? It's this. Number one, a non-criminal explanation is floated within hours or days. And this is before autopsy results even exist, before witness accounts are taken, and before an investigation is completed and sometimes even begun in the first place. Number two, once the non-criminal framing is public, the investigative posture shifts, right? The investigative posture becomes confirmation and not inquiry, meaning they're just going to confirm the initial lie that was put out there in the first place instead of doing a real investigation to get to true answers. Number three, the burden of proof then inverts, which means that the grieving families now must provide their own investigation. In the modern day vernacular, that means putting up our own forensic evidence, such as independent autopsies, right? Doing our own homicidal investigation work because the powers that be aren't investigating anything as a homicide. They are actually just looking to confirm the initial story that was floated in hours, potentially by the perpetrators. And then number four, the official narrative in each case rests substantially on the accounts of the last people to see the victim alive. The very people who should be at the center of a homicidal investigation, or at least be treated as witnesses of interest. This is a pattern. And I think it's important for us to understand that this pattern didn't start with Nolan Wells. This is the same pattern that they were using over 100 years ago as part of lynching practices. You know, we look back at lynchings today and we see the evidence of it. We see the postcards. We see the horrific pictures. We know about what happened. And we know that the perpetrators typically were not punished at all. But we oftentimes didn't know that the pattern of how it happened is point for point the same thing that continues to happen to this day with Nolan and with so many others. Now, though we know of the history of lynchings, chronicled to take part in this nation through the period of 1877 to 1950, most of us think that they stopped in 1950. I want you to know that there are others who believe that they never stopped. Most notably, Jill Collen Jefferson, the founder and executive director of the civil rights organization Jillian, named after her mentor, Jillian Bond. She argues that lynchings have never ended, and she's continued to study and chronicle lynchings that have taken place in the South post the 1950s that currently have not been investigated as lynchings. In fact, she found that between 2000 and 2025, there were 70 plus suspected modern day lynchings, with the most lynchings being in the very same state that had the most lynchings in the historic lynching era. And that state, of course, was Mississippi, the same state where Nolan met his fate. Now, in terms of this same pattern, let's take a look at some other modern day lynchings that have happened just in Mississippi since 2022. Remember the name of Rasheem Carter. He was only 25. This young man was being chased by a group of white men in a truck. He called his mother. His mother told him to go to a police department and let them know. He did that. He went to the police, not once, but twice. And at no point did they actually help him. Soon after, he went missing. And by the time they found him in pieces. They found his head in one place. They found his spine in another place. They found parts of his body scattered all over. And even though you have these circumstances of him being chased, of him notifying the police, of him being beheaded and dismembered, you know what they found to be the cause of death for Rasheem? Undetermined. Undetermined. No arrests, no justice. He just wound up dead and chopped up into multiple pieces dispersed across a Mississippi forest. But that's not all. You have Dexter Wade, 37. This happened in 2023. He was struck and killed by an SUV driven by an off-duty policeman in Jackson, Mississippi. His parents weren't notified. There was no attempt, apparently, to find his family. Instead, you know what they did? They just took his body and buried it in the back of a jail. His mother searched for him for months. And when they finally found his body, it exposed 200 plus additional bodies buried in unmarked graves near that jail. The state didn't investigate it. They disposed of the body before the family knew about it. And even after they found his body, there was no investigation of his death. To this day, no charges against the police officer that killed him and buried him. Another example, Trey Reed, only 21, a Delta State University student, found hanging from a tree on campus only about 50 miles from the area that Emmett Till's body was found. His death was ruled a suicide 3 days after he was found. This in spite of the fact that the family was lied to by the police. The police told the family that he was found in his dorm room when actually he was found hanging from a tree. No charges. And though this last one did not happen in Mississippi, it follows the same pattern. Tamla Horsford, 40-year-old mother of 5. And just like Nolan, she was the only Black person in a friend group. Hers was a friend group of other women, football moms. Their children all apparently played football together. Well, she went over to do a sleepover at a football mom's house and ended up dead. Broken neck, lacerated heart ventricle, fractured wrist, seen, never preserved, or even investigated as if some foul play occurred. Her death was assumed to be an accident within 1 hour of being discovered by the police. Conveniently, the homeowners had turned off their security cameras, so there was no video footage of what actually happened during this quote unquote sleepover. An independent autopsy conducted by the family found apparent defensive wounds that were unexplained and that did not align with what the witnesses said happened that night. One of the party attendees, who was a county court officer, was fired after this event, not because of the event, but because she repeatedly kept accessing the incident report. So why would she repeatedly keep accessing the report if this was merely an accident, as they claimed? Once again, this case closed. No charges, no convictions, no justice. You see, what happened to Nolan is part of this pattern. Lynching never ended in this nation. We just stopped calling it lynchings. The same pattern that Ida B. Wells found and described back in the early 1900s is the very same pattern that we are experiencing today. A narrative is established, just like this mother established the narrative by opening back up her Facebook and creating an alibi for her family and a story for her family. That narrative is accepted as truth by investigators who don't preserve any sort of crime scene. They do an investigation that is more confirmation than investigation. The family has to seek justice themselves by having their own independent investigation, their own independent autopsy. All of the patterns that we've seen in the past, we are seeing again. Lynchings never ended. Nolan is just the latest. And so as his family goes through the process of fighting for justice for him, we have to understand that there is something specific we can do if we want to create the foundation that's necessary to seek justice. I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but the reality is vote, 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 vote. The coroner is an elected position in Mississippi. The sheriff, the DA, judges, all are elected positions. As long as you have these very, very critical, powerful positions held by people who are more concerned with hiding the truth instead of finding the truth, we will continue to be lynched in Mississippi and beyond without even the expectation of any justice to occur. The power to change this is in our hands. It's in our hands. And it's yet another reason why we need to make sure that we make our voices heard at the polls, as well as continue to put the pressure on with regards to this case until we finally get to the truth. I'll also say one last thing about this case. I have noticed that at least one of Nolan's supposed white friends has come out that was with him on that day. Interesting that he's come out to do this interview with this known Clarence Thomas-like Black influencer, in which he's looking obviously to exonerate himself. He positions himself as Nolan's best friend, but he mentions that he's never been to Nolan's house. Huh? I'm the mother of sons. My children's best friends came over to our house. I knew their parents. And even if that didn't happen, you would go to your best friend's funeral. He didn't. What they're doing right now is putting a narrative in the public sphere that will coordinate with what the police findings are as a way to try to quell any uprising that might happen once Mississippi releases their lies about what happened to this young man. Because you cannot tell me that if everything was normal with his throat, that they wouldn't have just sent it on to the independent medical examiner for it to be examined along with the rest of the body. And by the way, he didn't get the lungs either. So he couldn't determine whether or not there was water in the lungs. Since Mississippi had the first opportunity to examine the body, they also had the first opportunity to sabotage the second autopsy. And that's exactly what they did. Here's what we have to remember as Black parents. The harsh reality is our children just are not safe in all white spaces. They're not safe emotionally. They're not safe physically in all white spaces. This is the saddest lesson from the Nolan experience. And I don't say that out of reflex. I wrote a report many years ago, Black Girls in New York, Quiet Strength, Bold Resilience. And as part of that work, I examined studies that looked at the development of Black children, and particularly when it comes to Black girls, for example, emotionally, them being in all white spaces like very elite schools is very emotionally damaging for many of our Black girls. They grow up in these spaces where they are rejected by both the white boys and the Black boys. They aren't really part of the white girlfriend group, wholly being accepted as they are. And so they grow up with a lot of self-esteem challenges in those spaces. The boys typically are more easily accepted because oftentimes they are brought into those spaces because of their athletic ability. They are like the star of the football team or the star of the basketball team. And as part of that athletic stardom, they have a greater sense of acceptance than their female counterparts. However, what Nolan teaches us, even though Nolan was in fact a football player and apparently a very good one in his own right, the reality is when something goes wrong, they're not there for you. When something goes wrong, they close ranks among themselves. When something goes wrong, you are isolated. There have been rumors that have been floating around about this potentially being some sort of Klan initiation ritual in terms of what actually led to Nolan's demise. I clearly don't know whether or not there is any substance to that. But I will say this. What is happening right now is very much part of a pattern that we have seen since the Klan era of how Black people are murdered, how narratives are put out there initially, literally within hours, how those initial narratives by the last people to see that person alive are accepted as truth by quote unquote law enforcement, how investigations seem to drag on forever, how the family has to do their own investigation in order to have some semblance of truth, and how at the end of the day, somehow no one is ever charged. How many times do we have to see this same story play over and over and over again until we say enough? This happens because those in power have the power to do it. But guess what? We have the power to take those in power and get them out of power and put in power those people who are truly committed to justice. We have the power to elect coroners, judges, DAs, sheriffs, all of those who are in decision-making positions around cases like Nolan's. And this is why I never really understood all of this resonance around, oh my God, Kamala is a cop. Do you want all the DAs to look like the Mississippi people? Or do you want DAs that are actually going to go out there and fight for justice when your son, your daughter, your friend, your partner is murdered and everyone is acting like nothing could have gone awry? We're just going to take on face value the story that was placed into the public narrative from the very beginning as truth. We need to be in those spaces. And so as you are thinking about this year's midterm elections and maximizing our voting power as it relates to the House, the Senate, I want you to also know that it's very important to look down the ballot as well, making sure that you have people who have your interest in these key positions. Because until we root out those people who will cover up instead of investigate crimes against your children, my children, and those children who find themselves in these tragic situations, things will never change. Throughout the history of this country, there is one thing I can tell you that has been true. We have never been given shit. We have fought for each and everything that we have gotten in the form of anything close to justice in this nation. And we will have to fight to get it in this instance with Nolan, and we'll have to fight to get it in future instances. And the way that we get it ultimately is to make sure that we are among those who are in positions of power. You cannot tell me that if you had a coroner that was truly interested in justice in Mississippi, that they would be slow rolling it like they are right now. You couldn't tell me that if you had people that were interested in justice, you wouldn't have somebody calling in those kids who were on that boat with Nolan to have some testimony, even though they've all lawyered up immediately. We need to see more aggressive investigations. And until we do this, Nolan will be just like the 70 plus modern day lynchings that have been identified as having occurred since 2000. None of them have resulted in indictments, much less convictions of murder. This is happening on our watch, and it's our responsibility to end it right now. The power is in your hands to make change. You have the opportunity to vote in or vote out coroners. You have the opportunity to vote in or vote out judges. You have the opportunity to vote in or vote out district attorneys. You have the opportunities to vote in or vote out sheriffs. Use those powers. This is a cabal of criminal activity that we've seen around Black life literally for hundreds of years. And it's because you have had white supremacists in those specific spaces for years. The entire reason why the Klan, for example, wore hoods is because they didn't want you to see that they were the sheriffs, the coroners, the DAs, the judges. They didn't want you to see who they were. And guess what? Our ancestors understood that, which is one of the core reasons why they fought so hard to get the right to vote. And now that we have it, we have people blowing it off, which is their wet dream. The fact that they have done such a good job of oppressing some of us that we don't even understand that we have the power to make change. And as a result, we sit home and continue to allow a situation where when we're not voting and other people are, we are engaged in unilateral disarmament. And those people that are voting in the crooked coroners. They're voting in the crooked DAs. They're voting in the crooked judges. Please make sure, especially right now, that we have taken this huge hit to our voting rights, that you do any and everything possible to ensure that not only you vote, but everyone in your friend group votes, everyone in your family votes. We have got to assert our power in these situations, especially because in places like Mississippi, there's a huge Black population. We have enough voting age people to run this shit if we chose to use our power. And until we do that, there will continue to be more Nolan Wells. There'll continue to be more Rasheem Carters. There'll continue to be more Dexter Wades. There'll continue to be more Trey Reeds. There'll continue to be more Tamla Horsfords. There'll continue to be the 70 plus lynching victims that we've seen since 2020 with zero justice. We have a say in this. We have a say in this. Let's use it. And until then, we continue to hope for justice in the Nolan Wells case, and we'll continue to fight for justice for all of those who have faced this fate and whose cases have been closed without justice being served. We do them no favors without changing this dynamic. And that starts right now. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Fearless Politics.